Hello, and welcome back to Thinking Deliberately. This is episode 15, and it's about education and why is it still pedagogy and not andragogy. So let me begin with something that may annoy a few universities, and this is after my experience of the last 15 years or so. Most higher education is not really adult education. It's childhood education with older students. And this is what's propelled me to do my second PhD. We change the vocabulary and we add coffee, but underneath, the model often stays the same. The teacher knows, the learner receives, the content is delivered, the assessment checks whether the learner can reproduce it, and then the institution decides what counts as knowledge. That is pedagogy. And in some cases, it might be sophisticated pedagogy. It may involve journals, case studies, group work, reflective practice, loads of presentations, blah, 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 27 learning outcomes, but the underlying structure is often unchanged. Someone knows, someone else must learn it. Then the learner needs to prove that they've learned it by performing successfully inside the system. And that's not necessarily adult development. It might be training, and it's definitely horizontal, but it's not vertical. So it may be compliance with better reference, and it's possibly a little bit, it's not necessarily andragogy. And that matters here because adults are not simply large children. Adults arrive carrying far more than a notebook. Every adult walks into a classroom carrying an invisible curriculum, whether that's their identity, profession, family, beliefs, politics, culture, you name it. Their need to appear competent is key. Their hope that the learning will not disturb them too much, and that invisible curriculum may matter more than the official one. Because adults do not simply receive new information. They interpret it through the self they have already constructed. They fit it into existing maps, and they accept what feels compatible. They may reject what threatens identity. They reinterpret what creates discomfort, and then they defend what has previously made life coherent. Now imagine being from another country and coming here and doing all of that. What was comfort? What was coherence? And that's why adult learning is not simply about content, it's about construction. And this is where the distinction between pedagogy and andragogy becomes important. Pedagogy is traditionally associated with education of children, the ped part. Children need structure, they need knowledge, they need guidance. And that's what Vygotsky said about more knowledgeable other. They need adults to create the conditions in which learning can occur. And there's nothing wrong with that. But adult learners are different. We're not children. Not because they are automatically more mature. As we explored in the last episode, age doesn't necessarily guarantee development. Adults are different because they arrive with constructed worlds already in place. They do not need merely more information. So they don't need a more knowledgeable other. And in my research, what I created was something called the zone of dynamic development. We'll talk about that. They may need the structure through which they interpret information to become visible, and that's a much deeper task. Malcolm Knowles helped to make andragogy widely known. He argued that adult learners tend to be more self-directed. They bring experience, they want relevant learning, they are often problem-centered, and they may be internally motivated. That was an important step. It recognised that adults should not be taught exactly like children. But I think it stopped one step too early. Adults are not simply experienced learners. They are constructors of meaning. And unless education engages the construction, the learning may leave the learner fundamentally unchanged. They might know a little bit more, maybe even be a bit more skilled, and that might help their employability, especially if they get a certificate. But they may still construct self, context, and response from exactly the same level of awareness. And that's the problem. This was actually the original idea for my PhD, was to look at the developmental levels of supervisors versus PhD students. But for some reason, my supervisors didn't want to be profiled. Weird. Education can add information without creating development. It can make someone more knowledgeable without making them more aware. And it can make someone more articulate without making them more reflective. What about confidence and competence without making them trustworthy? It can make someone much better at defending the self they arrived with. And that last one is key. Some of the least developmentally aware people you will ever meet are highly educated. They can recite research, use theory, quote philosophers, discuss systems, produce elegant arguments, and still become deeply defensive the moment their identity is touched. Education did not develop the awareness beneath the thinking. It simply gave the current construction better equipment. And that's why an educated, low awareness person can be more dangerous than an uneducated one. They can rationalize more elegantly, they can dominate more persuasively, and they can use theory as armor. They can hide poor construction behind sophisticated language, and they can be wrong in a more impressive accent. And that's not an argument against knowledge, because knowledge obviously is important. Evidence is important, expertise is important. The problem is that we have mistaken them for development. They are not the same. This is why you can see through arguments by intelligent people, because they're not constructing the argument, they're constructing their perspective. And if their perspective is from, let's say, AQ5, somebody AQ8 will see the pattern and break through their argument. So now let's apply that to adults and teaching. Andragogy should not merely ask, what does this adult need to know? It should also ask, how does this adult currently construct knowing? What do they accept as evidence? What do they dismiss? What makes them feel threatened, and what identity are they defending? What assumptions organize their attentions? Those are developmental questions, and most education avoids them. Why? Because they're difficult. It's much easier to deliver content than to disturb construction. But in my experience here, it's also the thing that propelled me to do the PhD was that you would have a lecturer who was more than capable of teaching 18, 19-year-olds at level 4 of a degree. But if you put them in front of 35-year-old apprentices who already have jobs and an element of opinion and a level of complexity, the lecturer might fail because they don't feel comfortable. That is why the new PhD looks at andragogy from the perspective of the lecturer's capacity and capability, not the adult learner. Okay, so it's easier to mark an essay than it is to assess changes in awareness. And it's easier to check whether a learning outcome has been demonstrated than ask whether the learner can now hold more complexity. And that's why it was always difficult to try and write a complexity module at the universities. It's easier to create reflective assignments than develop real-time awareness. And that distinction is important. Reflection looks backwards. Awareness operates now. So reflection says, well, what happened? Whereas awareness asks, what am I constructing while this is happening? You've then got to have a lecturer capable of extrapolating out the awareness of the adult learner in the moment to determine what they are constructing, which means that the lecturer then has to be a level above the learner in their cognitive complexity. You can see where the issues arise. So that's why the PhD is going to be really interesting. Awareness creates the possibility of choice. Universities love reflection because it can be submitted, it can be marked and moderated. It can be placed neatly into an assessment framework. But a beautifully written reflective account does not prove that awareness will be available when the learner is criticized, confused, frightened, challenged, or under pressure. That is where development is tested, not in the paragraph afterwards, it's in the moment. A manager may understand conflict theory and still avoid conflict. A leader may know coaching models and still use questions to control. A police officer may know bias training and still construct threat automatically. And a teacher may understand student-centered learning and still need to be the source of all authority. The model is not the issue. The construction using the model is. That's why most corporate training fails. Corporate training is often pedagogy with pastries and coffee. People sit in a room, the facilitator delivers a framework, there are activities, there are flip charts, there are coloured pens. Someone says, let's break into groups. One person dominates, several people hide, someone performs enthusiasm, and someone makes the obligatory joke about role playing. Then everyone completes an evaluation form at the end. The facilitator receives 4.7 out of 5, and the organisation declares a program a success. That's why my workshops are very different. It's a conversation, it's a debate, it's an interaction. Basically, once you go back to work, once these people go back to work, the same construction reappears. They haven't grown their thinking. They've just reinforced what they already knew, that they probably read in a book 10 minutes previously. So, as you know, that is not development. You've got vocabulary acquisition because they now know 4 words instead of 1 for something that they did every day. The training may have changed what people say, but it's not necessarily changed what they can see, and that is the central difference. Real andragogy should increase what becomes available to awareness. It should not merely ask, did the learner understand the model? It should ask, what can the learner now see that was previously invisible? What assumption became visible? What interpretation became questionable? What identity became available for examination, and what response became possible? What did the learner notice about the self using the model? That is adult education, not simply acquiring a tool, becoming aware of the person holding it, because a good tool in the hands of low awareness may simply make the current problem more effective. A controlling manager learns coaching and now controls through questions. A perfectionist learns productivity systems and becomes more efficient at exhaustion. Maybe a defensive leader learns emotional intelligence and becomes better at sounding calm while protecting their image. A people pleaser learns boundaries and uses them to avoid relationships. How about a lecturer learns inclusive teaching techniques but still constructs knowledge as something delivered from authority? New technique, same construction. That is why andragogy must become developmental. It must work with the adult as a constructing self, not an empty container, not a customer, not a passive recipient or a unit of assessment, a constructing self. This also means taking experience seriously without worshipping it. Adults bring experience into learning, and that's valuable. Experience gives material, but experience is not automatically wisdom, as we discussed a few episodes ago. People say, in my experience, and sometimes what follows is genuine insight. Sometimes what follows is 20 years of repetition mistaken for experience and expertise. Experience can deepen understanding. It can also harden assumptions. It can become a fortress. A role of adult education is not simply to validate experience. It must be to make experience available for examination. What did you construct from what happened? What meaning did you make? What pattern did you repeat? What did your experience teach you? And what might it have prevented you from seeing? That is andragogy. It respects experience enough to challenge it, and it challenges the learner without humiliating them, and that balance is really key. Adult learners need enough safety to remain present, but not so much comfort that nothing is disturbed. Psychological safety should not mean intellectual anesthetic. It should mean the conditions in which difficult awareness can be tolerated. I did this all the time when teaching apprentices. Recognize that the people in the room are just as experienced, if not more so than you are. Invite their opinion, get them engaged, because what they're getting engaged with is their experience and their perspective. That makes the whole teaching of andragogy so much more useful and beneficial to everybody. A safe learning environment is not one in which nobody feels uncomfortable. It is one in which discomfort can become developmental rather than destructive. The learner can say, well, I may have been wrong, or I do not understand this yet. This challenges something important to me. And that is adult learning, because development often begins when the current construction stops working. The learner encounters something the existing map cannot absorb. Obviously, Piaget called this disequilibrium. At that moment, several things can happen. They can reject the material, blame the teacher, dismiss the theory, perform compliance, memorize enough to pass the exam, or stay with the difficulty. And that last possibility is where andragogy begins. That's also where my lecturing begins. Not in the transfer of information, because that's secondary. In the learner's capacity to remain present when the old construction becomes inadequate. And the educator's role is not simply to rescue them from that discomfort. Sometimes teachers explain too quickly. A learner struggles, bit of silence, confusion enters the room. The teacher interprets it as failure and immediately fills the gap. But confusion may be development happening. It may be the sound of an old map failing, and if the teacher or lecturer removes the discomfort too quickly, the learner never has to construct something more adequate, and that's why adult education requires judgment. In my parlance, obviously a higher level of the AQ. When do you explain? When do you challenge? When do you support? Can you recognize that they need support? When do you just shut up and let them get on with it? When do you provide structure and allow the learner to wrestle with what they're trying to do? Technique alone cannot decide that. Awareness must. And this is where constructive development theory adds something important. CDT suggests that adult education should develop the capacity to become aware of the construction of self, context, and response. The learner is not simply asked to know something. They are invited to notice how they are making meaning, how intention shapes attention, how identity shapes their interpretation, and how emotion shapes certainty. What about their assumptions? How does it narrow their choices? Or maybe their response makes construction real. That is constructional development. And that is where I think transformative andragogy begins. That will be the basis of my new PhD. Adult education should not merely ask, what did the learner understand? It should ask, what became available to awareness that was not available before? Because if awareness has not changed, education may only have rearranged information. And that then is the test of the lecturer, not just the adult learner. Can the learner now see more, hold more, question more carefully, respond more deliberately? Can they recognize when they are embedded in a construction? Can they notice assumptions before assumptions become conclusions? Can they change their mind without experiencing it as humiliation or cognitive dissonance? Can they distinguish confidence from certainty? Can they remain unfinished without feeling defective? If education develops those capacities, it has done something profound. If it does not, we should be honest about what it has done. And it may have trained someone, qualified them, gave them credentials and a certificate, all potentially valuable, but not the same as adult development. And this is really important now, more than ever. Information is no longer scarce with all the LLMs that we're looking at. AI can produce summaries, arguments, lesson plans, reports, essays, explanations, and answers in seconds. If education remains primarily the transfer and reproduction of information, then education is competing with a machine on the machine's strongest territory. That is not promising. The future value of education must be developmental. Not merely what can you remember, but how do you think? How do you know your epistemic stance? How do you construct? What can you see? What can you hold? What can you revise? And what becomes possible when awareness increases? That is where human education still matters. Not because humans possess more information, because humans can develop their relationship to construction. Or at least they can if education stops treating them as containers. So here is the uncomfortable question for this episode. Have you been educated? Or have you simply learned how to succeed inside educational systems? Mark Twain once said, I was educated once. It took me years to get over it. Did education increase your awareness or just your vocabulary? Did it develop your capacity to think or your ability to reproduce approved forms of thought? And if you teach adults, what are you actually developing? Knowledge, skills, compliance, or awareness? Because adult education should not be childhood education with older students. It should be a developmental encounter with constructing, responsible, unfinished selves. This is thinking deliberately. And today's uncomfortable thought is this. If education does not increase awareness, then perhaps it's just not educated the adult at all. It has only made the existing construction better informed. And that to me is the difference between a lecturer and a developmentalist. Thank you.